All right, YouTube, for the benefits of the Christians that continually come and are so kind and talk to me about their book and why I should read it. I already have, but why I should read it again, I guess. Why I should take their God and book seriously, and usually why I'm going to bathe in fire for the rest of eternity. I'd like to address the Bible itself and try to explain to these Christians this similar line of thought works for the Quran also. I will be attempting to make a video on why the Quran is wrong, has changed, is not miraculous, and so forth, either today or fairly soon. But right now I'll focus on the Bible, because I've studied it more, and therefore I have more, knowledge about its actual content and the history behind it, explaining why I don't take it seriously and why when people tell me to either read it or they start spamming verses, it has no effect other than really to annoy me, especially the spam. And essentially, this is simply because the Bible, as it appears today, which people attempt to interpret in 1,000 different ways, depending on which church they happen to belong to. They might be Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox. There are various subgroups within each of these classifications. Yes, Catholicism does have splinter groups that have come off of it as well, although they claim that that's not the case and that there's only one apostolic Catholic Church. Um, Essentially, they are attempting to interpret a book, which in turn is an interpretation unto itself. Especially the modern Protestant Bible, the KJV, is politically informed by the Church of England and by their royalty over there. Going back further, it's again an interpretation of a translation made several centuries earlier, which is in turn a translation and an adaptation on the canon compiled at Nicaea, which in turn is essentially a misuse of these works and perhaps the false canonization of various texts and the leaving out of other texts at Nicaea, which is in turn an adaptation of various texts written by different cultural groups over a very long time period, perhaps as much as 1,000 years. The Jews claim even longer than that, but legitimately over the course of almost 1,000 years, by people living in different locations with totally different political leanings, with totally different linguistic variation on who would have been writing these scriptures, whether it be in Greek or Aramaic, Hebrew, essentially, or any of these other languages, Syriac in some cases, depending on whether you talk about the Gnostic Gospels, Coptic, perhaps later. Um, Essentially, you have a multi-level system here by which you have repeatedly translated, construed different meanings, interpreted, and collected different texts over time. There are dozens of different Bibles in use today, and if you look at them, although they have the basic same essential plot and the essentially same content, they have different words that have slightly different meanings. For instance, one of the most famous, is it thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder? Most modern Christians prefer thou shalt not murder, even though, of course, even back when I was a kid, it was thou shalt not kill. Don't kill people. They changed it to thou shalt not murder preferentially upon 9/11, because then people started saying, well, is it actually Christian to go to war? They said, well, we've got to support our wonderful Christian country. So now it's thou shalt not murder, which is probably a perversion of the original meaning of the term. Or in other words, or it could be a restoration of the original meaning that was misconstrued for thousands of years, but now is accurate for many centuries. On top of this, it's almost like a video game when you look at the Bible, because there are expansion packs. You can get the special Mormon expansion pack for only $3 from our data processing center in Salt Lake City, Utah. With a free Arabic translation, you can get the special Islamic expansion pack. Because remember, the Mormons and Islamists both claim to have the true final revelational material, the final prophecy. Joseph Smith is the final prophet. Well, originally Jesus was the final prophet. Then it was, no, maybe Paul's sort of the final prophet. Then it was, no, Muhammad's the final prophet. Then it was Joseph Smith is the final prophet. Or you can even buy the Jehovah's Witnesses expansion pack. If you want creepy people to show up at your door at 3 a.m. and attempt to barge into your home, that's the other final prophecy. So you keep getting all of these sort of final scriptures tacked onto this original work as well. Mainstream Christians don't accept any of them as legitimate, but they are there, and they are all religious forces within the world today. There are even New Age expansion packs, like the special Messianic Jewish expansion pack, for those of you who want to live a kosher lifestyle while still worshiping Jesus as the Son of God. Because there are so many translations, variations, offshoots, and so forth of this book, I can't take it seriously. Because my thought is, if it were truly the Word of God, if there was actually some sort of cosmic divine being behind its inception, why these books were written in the first place, it would not have changed over time. It would have remained the same. There wouldn't be all of these different, there might be linguistic differences from translation to translation, but it only would have needed to be translated once. There would be some sort of original copy that actually dates to the time when these texts were written, and they would have been compiled the entire time so that people would know which texts were legitimate. Because right now there are dozens of works, the Book of Enoch, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, Bel and the Dragon, and books like that, the Gospel of Judas, which are left out of the canon, but which were written contemporary to other New Testament works in some cases, the Gospel of Nicodemus and so forth, which contain similar content, and which simply were not found acceptable at Nicaea by the Roman patriarchy, essentially, the Roman prelates, the Roman government, who was reigning at the time and had co-opted Christianity. And thus, the Bible contains essentially Roman theology when you really think about it, because, of course, they left out books that didn't enforce their own cultural values. Christianity affected Rome, but Rome also affected Christianity greatly. That led to Catholicism. Of course, Catholicism now has also been changed from its original inception. If the Bible were true, I would expect people to glean one single meaning from it. They would know, generally, so there might be some dissent, but there wouldn't be the amount there is now with 1,000 different subgroups of Christianity. They would know which verses were to be taken as metaphor, if any, which were to be taken literally, if any. There would be a definite historical timetable. You would know most likely when about these works were written and by who. We don't even know the authors for some of these works. And people would come to similar conclusions about that work. There wouldn't be this debate over was Jesus Son of God, prophet, healer? Was he sort of a philosopher? Was he a magician of some sort? Was he just a regular dude who sort of got swept up in this all and people thought he was divine and he actually was just a normal dude? Are most of these stories anecdotal? Are they actual history, or are they more metaphor? People don't know. They have 1,000 different conclusions drawn from this one text, mainly because this one text has been transmogrified so much over time. So I can't take it seriously. Now, to Islam, briefly, because the main point of this video is to address the Bible. Islamists claim the same thing. Well, our Quran's unchanged. It hasn't changed. Allah is the one God. Jesus was a Muslim, even though he existed, 1,000 years before Islam existed almost, which makes several centuries before Muhammad did, certainly, which makes no sense to me. Islam is a medieval origin religion. It doesn't date back to the early Iron Age by any means. Jesus was a Muslim, Moses was a Muslim, Abraham was a Muslim. The Quran hasn't changed. There are all sorts of miracles in it. No, there aren't. And I'll explain that in a video to be announced later. The Quran is just like the Bible. It has been changed over time. The original version that was compiled by memory through the surahs was destroyed. It was then attested to have been replaced by a more official version, which a particular Arabian king reigning over the area at the time happened to like more because it had content he liked. And he said, well, my way is better. I accept these parts of this book and not these other ones. Those aren't accurate because I say so, because I'm the king. And anyone who doesn't agree with me can go to hell, and I'll just behead him or, crucify him or something like that. You have one story, anecdotal again, about Aisha's goat supposedly eating several pages from the original Quran, and nobody could remember, so they just sort of made it up as they went along. So it's the same thing, even with the Jewish scriptures. I've pointed this out before. The Jews borrow, because they were henotheists, they borrowed some of their mythology from Babylon, which is also Assyria, Samaria, all of these sort of pagan empires, kingdoms, and the tribal groups that composed them before they rose to power. The Jews borrowed all of this stuff. Lilitu, from Sumerian mythology, became Lilith. There's no longer a question that this is the fact, that the Sumerians were either, depending on the group, they're probably Lilith cults at the time too, were either venerating or fearing this particular sort of demonic female energy or entity, and the Jews enshrine that in their mythology. It's not in the Bible, but it is in Jewish mythology that's outside of the Bible. The same Christians that say, well, the Old Testament is the Word of God because it's in the Bible, don't seem to realize there are a lot of other Jewish mythological scriptures written around the same time, some even older, that aren't in the Bible, and they don't study them. They talk about Lucifer as though Lucifer was Satan, which is not the actual case. The devil, Satan, and Lucifer are different beings. They even use the wrong name, by the way. Lucifer is just the Latin description of this being. They talk about this fallen angel. That doesn't appear in the Bible. The allusion to falling from heaven in the Bible is talking about Jesus. The original story, which references this light bringer or this morning star, is simply talking about it's Jewish mythology. It's not in the actual canonized text of the Bible, and talks about this sort of angel, very beautiful, very powerful, convincing a third of the people a third of the angels to rebel. They go to war, and God destroys them, casts them down to earth, and they spawn giants and so forth. You see allusions to this in the Bible. You see mentions of similar material in the Bible. But the actual story itself is not there. And to Christians who take the Old Testament, either metaphorically or literally, doesn't matter, but who assume that it's divinely inspired, you should probably read those Jewish mythological stories, because they are essentially explaining the exact same events that it's talking about in the Old Testament. But you haven't read them, probably because you didn't know they existed. Most Christians haven't even read very large parts of their Bible. You talk about the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, as it might be called, which is essentially a long, sort of erotic story. And you mention this to Christians, they say, well, that's not a book in the Bible, that doesn't exist. Yes, it does, it's right there in the King James Version. You haven't read it because most likely, like most Christians, you go to church and you sort of thumb through when the priest or the pastor is talking and giving a liturgy or whatever, and you read the stories that they're telling you they're currently talking about. Please flip to Matthew chapter 2, verses 10 through 15, or something like that. And you read those verses and you're like, oh, that's nice, and just heard a little bit about Jesus. Have you ever read the Bible cover to cover on your own? Because I've done it 5 times. I'm familiar with the content of the Bible, including the books that most people don't like to talk about. Books like Leviticus, which fire and brimstone preachers might bring up, but very few what you would consider modern Christian ministers and preachers are going to bring that book up, because it's full of hatred and bigotry and vileness and evil and sickness and disease. They're not going to talk about the Song of Solomon. In fact, this is a little known fact. The Song of Solomon refers to sort of this ruler, possibly Solomon, possibly some other ruler, and their sort of sexual desires, advances, and innuendos with one of their mistresses, sort of their on-the-side romantic lover. When this book was canonized and now into the modern age, Christians couldn't really decipher why this book was there. They said, why is there several pages of erotic literature right in the middle of the Bible? It doesn't cover spiritual topics. It's talking about this king having sex with his mistress. And they said, well, why is it there? So the bright idea that some of their theologians got was that it's actually an entirety of metaphor, that it's not actually, even though it's referencing an actual person and his actual physical encounters with this mistress or this slave, it's not exactly clear which is the case, his sort of love slave or whatever, they decided that no, it's metaphor and it's actually talking about the love between God and the church. It seems strange that God would command that the love between Jehovah or Yahweh or whatever and his church would be talked about in a manner similar to a man who's lusting after a woman, literally talking about honey coming from her belly button, although it's clearly referencing something slightly below that. It doesn't make any sense. This is why I can't take the Bible literally. I can't take it at face value. Much of it, I can't take at all, even as metaphor, because of its content. Then you go to things like, did Jesus even exist? Because the earliest mention we have of Jesus in any historical record comes from Tacitus, who wasn't even born until 56 AD. He wasn't even born until 23 years after Jesus supposedly died. He would have been an infant when people who remember Jesus, who were adults at the time, were already getting towards the end of their life, because the average lifespan back then was in the 50s roughly, maybe pushing 60 on some cases. A particularly healthy individual might live to see 70. Most of these people keeled over in their 40s and 50s. So they would have already been rather old, and of course small children probably wouldn't remember that much and wouldn't be able to tell much of a story about the whole Jesus thing. There is an earlier mention of Josephus. Of course, that's been exposed completely. We know now it's a medieval forgery because apparently in the original manuscript, the actual paper that composes this verse is from a totally different time period many centuries later. So excluding Josephus, you have Tacitus, who wasn't even, and he didn't even write about this until several decades later. That's past the lifetime of anyone who would have been old enough to remember this figure of Jesus, even in the latter years of his life, let alone his birth, anything about that. And of course, the Bible skips over his 20s. It goes straight from when he's 12 years old, and it glosses that over briefly, skips his 20s, and goes all the way till he's 30 years old. You're missing about 18 years of Jesus' life, which are covered briefly in some Gnostic Gospels, and that's about it. You have the infancy Gospels of Thomas, which may or may not even be contemporary to the time period. And then you have the dating of the New Testament works at length, because the oldest pieces, the oldest fragments that exist from any of these books are from the 100s AD, from much, much later, many decades later. The earliest proposed date is somewhere around 55-60 AD for Mark. You don't actually have any physical material from before about 100 AD mentioning Jesus. And this is just Jesus, really. This isn't even talking about the dating of the Old Testament and when those might date to. 600 BC, or was it, 10 BC? We're not exactly sure. Because we can't determine the dating, we don't have a lot of historical material outside of the Bible, other than Sumerian pagan mythology and Babylonian mythology in some cases with Genesis, and possibly the story of Enoch. And some Gnostic Gospels as well might allude to similar things to Sumerian lore. Because of the problems with dating and the multiple translations and people's interpretation of these works and how different they can be and how much violence really has been spawned by people misconstruing what's in the Bible, I cannot take it seriously. When people show me biblical verses and say, well, this is the word of God, how can you not react? How can you reject God and worship the devil, which I don't do, or worship Satan, which I don't do? Or how can you not believe in this wonderful God that just wants to save you and stuff? Well, I'm not even sure that's what Jesus is commanding me to do, even if he existed. Because these manuscripts were written so much later, it's not clear he actually said or did any of these things, even if I assume he was a real person. And because parts of the Old Testament are completely ripped off from pagan lore, what does that say about the Jews and their overall content? Well, why should I take this God seriously? They're simply choosing a pagan god at random and elevating it to the status of monotheistic deity. Although the Jews still to this day are not technically monotheistic. They worship one god, but they kind of still do, in some occult circles, believe in certain other beings which have cosmic power, making them henotheistic. One final thing that I've pointed out before, but since new people will presumably watch this video, I'll point it out here as well. When the Bible mentions Yahweh in Genesis, when it uses that actual term Elohim, Elohim in Hebrew can be plural. If we understand that the Jews are henotheists, they are literally saying that not a god, but the gods in plural created mankind, which utterly and completely changes the entire meaning of the Bible. But because most biblical readers, most people who read the Bible and try to interpret it, don't know Hebrew and don't know anything about this term Elohim, they're oblivious to this. And upon that basis alone, I can reject the Bible, because literally that one word, depending on whether it is plural or singular, utterly changes the very theological basis of all of the other writings. And since we can't determine whether it's meant to be plural or singular, you've got at most a 50-50 shot of getting it right. Even if every other word in the Bible is to be assumed true, that one word alone becomes a stumbling block which will preclude at least 50% of the population from heaven, even assuming there is such a place, and assuming that this deity or group of deities actually exists. So I do reject the Bible. I don't do it because I hate God, because I don't believe in that specific deity. If I'm going to venerate anything, it's going to be some natural cosmic force, or some deist force, or some natural force, or something like that. It's not going to be this deity that people can't even make up their minds about. You look at Odin or Zeus or something, and it's rather clear what they stand for. There's no difficulty interpreting what those deities mean, but you have this specific deity with all the expansion packs included, Mormons, Islamists, and Jehovah's Witnesses, and Messianic Jews, and so forth, and they're all completely confused about what this single God, supposedly, unless Elohim is plural, actually wants. They can't even tell me, or anyone else, what this deity actually desires man to do, because they've got so many interpretations of the same text. Which in turn has been interpreted, mistranslated, retranslated, adapted, recompiled so many times it almost loses any point. Because the Bible isn't even a book, it's a collection of books. It's a collection of short works, of manuscripts that was compiled in 325 AD. There was no Bible in early Christianity. It didn't exist. They had individual manuscripts that they considered sacred, and many more manuscripts than are actually in the Bible that's used today, the KJV General